Welcome to the 700 Club. Invade Ukraine and face severe consequences. That's President Biden's warning to Russia's Vladimir Putin. The two leaders will engage in a high-stakes call today.
Well, China is also rattling its saber, calling the president's diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics a provocation. And Iran isn't backing down on its nuclear program. So should the United States prepare for the worst? Jenna Browder brings us the story from Washington.
The United States is sending a clear message to Russia. Invade U.S. ally Ukraine, and we will respond.
What we've seen in recent weeks is a steady and unusual military buildup by the Russians along Ukraine's borders.
It comes as President Biden prepares to meet virtually with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who's expected to demand that Ukraine never joins NATO. The CIA director, William Burns.
We never underestimate President Putin's risk appetite on Ukraine. The president's conversation was an opportunity to reinforce, to reemphasize, the costs of a use of force, but to also emphasize of renewed military aggression, but to also emphasize the importance of de-escalation and a renewed effort at diplomacy.
Satellite images show Russian troops amassed on Ukraine's border, with U.S. intelligence warning that Russia is planning an offensive early next year with 175,000 troops. This is the front line of frozen landscape scarred by fighting.
We've consulted significantly with our allies and believe we have a path forward that would impose significant and severe harm on the Russian economy.
The White House says it's considering a range of options if Putin invades. Among them, sanctions, including the possibility of cutting Russia out of the international financial payment system, which could hurt it economically. Another possibility, providing more U.S. forces to Ukraine. Bradley Bowman with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies telling CBN News the U.S. should prepare for the worst.
It may be that only Putin knows what he's going to do, and he may not even know. At a minimum, what he's doing is clear. He's trying to use military power to get a diplomatic outcome.
Meanwhile, it's not just Russia. The Biden administration facing other major potential global threats. China also building up its strength. As the Wall Street Journal reports, classified U.S. intelligence suggests it may establish its first permanent military base on the Atlantic Ocean, on the west coast of Africa. A threat setting off alarm bells in Washington. And the administration has announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics to protest China's human rights abuses, something China calls a provocation. And then there's Iran and restarted talks aimed at restoring the 2015 nuclear deal. But so far, no deal, and it doesn't look like Iran is budging. The Iranians continuing to provocatively accelerate their nuclear program. For now, though, Russia's potential move against Ukraine is the top concern. And here in Washington, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are urging President Biden to take a firm stance with Vladimir Putin. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Please pray for our president today. He really needs prayer. Everyone in our Congress, everyone in the Senate, everyone in the administration, everyone in the State Department, please be in prayer for them today. These threats are real. If Russia invades Ukraine, that could spark off an incredible war that would involve all the world. If China invades Taiwan, that could spark off another war on the Pacific. And then you have Iran trying to get a nuclear weapon. And we all know their plan would be to use it on Tel Aviv as soon as they get it. So you look at these various threats, he needs unusual wisdom. He needs unusual strength. We are in very perilous times, and he needs prayer. In other news, gang members have released 3 more hostages from an American missionary group in Haiti. A dozen still remain in captivity. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. That group, Ohio-based Christian Aid Ministries, is calling on the public to pray and fast for the 12 people still held hostage and for the gang members behind the horrible crime. The nightmare began October 16th when 17 members of the missionary group were abducted during a trip to a Haitian orphanage, the youngest just 8 months old at the time. A notorious street gang called 400 Mawozo reportedly is responsible. They demanded $1 million for the return of each victim. 2 hostages were released last month. With gang violence rising amid economic and political turmoil in the country, the U.S. Embassy has asked all American missionaries to come home for their own safety. The apparent targeting of American church groups has sounded alarm bells for other missionaries like Bruce and Mary Melissa Vernon. They were thankful to make it home safely and told CBN News what it was like there in Haiti.
Sometimes we can hear gunshots from our house that we think are even associated with the 400 Mawozo gang who did the kidnapping of all the Anabaptist missionaries. Very few missionaries are left in Haiti at this time.
The couple hopes to go back to Haiti when the danger dies down. They're also asking people to pray for the safe release of the remaining captives and the gang members as well. Well, here at home, winter weather is already hitting parts of the United States, and even Hawaii has not been spared, as an unusually strong weather system brought some snow in the highest locations of the island state. The storm also brought high winds and extremely heavy rain, flooding roads and downing power lines. The rough weather hit says Hawaii and the country marks the 80th anniversary of the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor back in 1941, which led to the United States' entry into World War II. Every year, Pearl Harbor survivors, veterans, and visitors honor and remember the 2,400 service members and civilians killed during the attack. Well, on the other side of the country, businesses were surprised and some were angry when New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a vaccine mandate for private employers Monday. The mayor calls it a preemptive strike against COVID and its variants.
It's time to do something even bigger before Omicron asserts itself here. Before we get into the holiday gatherings. It's preemptive because we needed to do something bold quickly and get ahead of all of this.
But businesses quickly pushed back, questioning if the mayor's move was legal and calling it counterproductive.
There is so much stress, so much tension, many concerns, legitimate or not, that people have. We're trying to create a positive environment for people to come back to the workplace and not make it a negative one.
The mandates even include children from ages 5 to 11 for certain locations. Well, the pandemic led to what's been called the Great Resignation, with many people leaving their jobs. And now new numbers show 2 out of 5 pastors across the country are seriously considering leaving the work of the ministry. CBN's Brody Carter brings us this look at why church leaders want to quit and how believers can step up their support.
According to the Barna Group, the country's foremost researcher of all things religious, it's the highest number they've seen of pastors leaving or seriously considering stepping down from the pulpit. Now the pressure's on the church to help these leaders from joining the millions walking away from their jobs during the pandemic.
Pastors are people too, and so they're certainly showing some of the same kinds of things that others are doing in our society, which includes this consideration of just quitting, doing something different.
Thinking about quitting your job? Your pastor could be as well.
It's now 2 out of 5 pastors who say they're seriously considering quitting. It's the highest we've ever seen.
While studying trends in the church, Barna Research took a deep dive into leadership. That's when they found this red flag. 38% of pastors want to quit now, compared with 29% in January.
During and after the pandemic, about a third of Christians, practicing Christians, had disengaged from their congregation, just sort of stopped showing up.
Here are other concerns to consider. More than 4,000 churches closed in America in 2020. Over that same time period, more than 20,000 pastors left the ministry. On top of that, 50% of current pastors say they would leave the ministry if they had another way of making a living. So what's the deal?
Pastoring is incredibly difficult without a pandemic, right? You add on top of that the amount of interpersonal conflict that is taking place.
Dr. Dwayne Bond is a counselor and pastor at Wellspring Church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
I've just walked with a lot of men, and so bearing their burdens, it created incredible amounts of weight upon me, which is what God has called me to.
The pandemic also caused churches to remain closed for months at a time, which led to financial constraints for some. Now, continuing political strife over masks and vaccines are becoming a breaking point for many congregations.
There's different opinions. Everyone has an opinion, and it creates exhaustion and disunity. And I would just encourage every pastor to consider ventilating relationships, but also potentially even grabbing a counselor and kind of working through some of these things versus being forced to do it.
Dr. Bond sees this season of suffering as an opportunity for the church to provide support and hope for those dedicated to feeding our spiritual lives.
When you think about it, when the book of Acts, when affliction came, the church really exploded, right?
The pandemic, I think the long-term effect of it is going to really be a stronger church, but probably a smaller church.
Dr. Bond went on to say healing in the church begins with leaders, such as elders or deacons. He also recommends teaming up with other churches to give pastors a break, adding church leaders should never be ashamed for seeking counsel during difficult times. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Gordon, that is the hope that churches come out stronger after this pandemic.
Well, it is the hope, but let's recognize we need each other. So let's team together. That's great advice. Don't get isolated. Team together. Realize we're all in this, and that means we can all get through it. The pandemic has certainly devastated churches. When you can't go to church, all kinds of things happen from that. You don't have the same income level. You don't have the same enthusiasm in those meetings. What do you do? And wouldn't it be great if we could all get back to church and not be afraid of a virus and have this pandemic in the rear view? But that's right now not happening. So let's come alongside one another. Let's pray for one another and realize that financially churches need support. So let's do our part to be there for them.